Hey Dragon Slayers! Today's video is asking the question, why do so many doctors focus on glucose instead of insulin? So historically, because it is the cause of type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance has been lumped into the diabetes mellitus family of diseases. It wasn't until the 5th century in India that physicians noted two distinct different types of this disease. One is associated with a young age and losing weight, which most modern physicians would come to call type 1. The other is with older age and excess body weight, the known as type 2. Nonetheless, both were identified by excessive amounts of glucose loaded urine. This understandably led to the disease being defined by glucose, which was causing the common main observable symptom, polyuria, which is the scientific term for producing too much urine or peeing too much. However, in doing so, we ignored the other more relevant half of the problem, which is insulin. And while diabetes type 1 and 2 share the same symptom of excess glucose, they diverge completely when it comes to insulin. Whereas type 1 is caused by having too little insulin or none at all, type 2 is caused by having too much. This too much insulin is insulin resistance. And because of its association with type 2 diabetes, it became wrapped up in the glucose-centric perspective as well. Early physicians didn't have access to modern technology and screening techniques, so it's understandable that they focused on what they could observe. But by keeping focus on glucose in the modern day, well, scientifically, glucose is still more easily measured than insulin. To measure glucose, we only need a simple enzyme on a stick or a basic glucometer. And that technology has existed for roughly 100 years. Insulin, on the other hand, because of its molecular structure and characteristics, is way more difficult to measure. We don't have a test, or I guess we didn't have a test until the late 1950s, and it required handling radioactive material. The discovery was so revolutionary that Dr. Rosalind Yalow received a Nobel Prize for it. It's much simpler today, but still not so easy and not cheap. So, even though we can now measure insulin, this advance came about too late. We'd already committed to thinking of diabetes as being a glucose disease, and in turn, developed clinical diagnosis values for the disease based entirely on glucose. If we can identify type 2 diabetes by glucose levels, why not insulin resistance, which is also called prediabetes? Well, we failed to identify it because insulin resistance isn't necessarily a hyperglycemic state. In other words, some people can have insulin resistance and still enjoy perfectly normal blood glucose levels. Getting your blood glucose measured clinically is not part, or sorry, getting your blood insulin measured clinically is not part of the standard tests most doctors order. This is why we can have a scenario where a person is steadily becoming more and more insulin resistant, but the insulin is still working well enough to keep the blood glucose in a normal range. This can develop over years or even decades, but because we more typically look at glucose as the problem, we don't recognize there's an issue until the person is so insulin resistant that their insulin, no matter how much they produce, is no longer enough to keep their blood glucose in check. It's at this point, possibly years after the problem first started, that we finally noticed the disease. First, as mentioned, insulin resistance increases the risk of type 2 diabetes. This is true, but this relationship warrants further clarification. Type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance. That is, type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance that has progressed to the point where the body is unable to keep the blood glucose levels below the clinically relevant value of 126 milligrams per deciliter. We've known this for almost 100 years. German scientist Wilhelm Falta first proposed the idea in 1931. In other words, anytime you hear someone speaking about the evils of diabetes, you can substitute in insulin resistance instead, and it's immediately more accurate. For example, your neighbor doesn't have a family history of diabetes, she has a family history of insulin resistance. Most people with insulin resistance will ultimately die from heart disease or other cardiovascular complications. Others will develop Alzheimer's disease, breast or prostate cancers, or any number of other lethal diseases. Understanding how insulin resistance causes these disorders is essential to appreciating how important insulin is to our health. That's why we're going to dig deep and explore how insulin works throughout the body and just how insulin resistance causes these other diseases. Don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel out. And remember, guys, that together, you and I will slay the dreaded diabetes dragon.